Hello and welcome to today's webinar, which looks at some key property challenges facing the manufacturing sector. The challenges felt by the manufacturing industry have been significant in recent years, from Brexit, COVID-19 and escalating global conflict to domestic issues relating to skills shortages and a push to embrace technology and sustainability. Those in manufacturing are being forced to deal with rising operational costs, energy price volatility and increasing material expenses. The way in which industrial properties are run and managed plays a vital role in addressing these pressures, with the sector keen to ensure that properties and the operations running from them are managed as efficiently and cost effectively as possible, and are also able to adapt to a changing landscape. We're going to look at various key stages in the lifetime of a lease where operational efficiencies can be addressed. Sidra is going to start by looking at sustainability and green clauses, and I will then look at operational costs in the context of the manufacturing industry's often heavy electricity usage. I'll then end by looking at considerations at the end of a lease term, acknowledging that change and relocation may be necessary, but often those strategic moves can be difficult given the nature of the machinery and operations in situ. We will look at how the sector can ensure that it's in the best possible position to deal with dilapidations claims. I'll now hand over to Sidra for the first part of this webinar.
Thank you, Karen. Environmental, social and governance, or ESG considerations have become increasingly important with the real estate industry in recent years, with many property owners and occupiers having developed ESG policies to improve the environmental performance of their properties. As such, many property owners are adopting green leases to promote sustainability and reduce their carbon footprint. For commercial property investors, the trend towards ESG and green leases is highly relevant as it affects the value of and demand for real estate assets. There is also a growing preference among commercial tenants, particularly manufacturers, for properties that prioritise sustainability and environmental responsibility. Buildings that are energy efficient and have other eco-friendly features are likely to be more attractive to tenants, resulting in higher occupancy rates and potentially higher rental income for landlords. Recent changes to the EPC regulations have brought into focus the urgent need to improve the energy efficiency of commercial building stock in the UK, and we can expect to see the government focus on the green agenda with a further tightening of the minimum energy efficiency standards known as the MEES regulations in the future. Commercial property owners who are proactive in embracing ESG principles and adopting green leases are likely to be better positioned to meet these regulations and avoid any potential risks resulting from non-compliance. This in turn directly impacts the occupiers when they are presented with green leases, particularly those in the manufacturing industry with high energy consumption. So, what is a green lease? A green lease is a standard form lease with additional provisions included which are aimed at managing and improving the environmental performance of the building. Green leases provide an effective framework for both landlords and tenants to work together in achieving a common objective of reducing their environmental impact and in complying with future legislative requirements. Green leases benefit both parties. A sustainable building with lower running costs is more marketable for landlords and more cost effective for tenants to occupy. Green leases can range from light green to dark green. Light green leases include less responsibility on the parties, such as an agreement to discuss how to improve environmental performance. Dark green leases, on the other hand, contain more specific clauses which are legally binding and require a more significant level of commitment on environmental issues, such as requiring the parties to meet predetermined environmental targets. Turning now to what types of green leases, clauses green leases are likely to include. So the cooperation obligation. Green leases will include an obligation on the parties to cooperate with each other to identify appropriate strategies for the improvement of the environmental performance of the property and the building. Improving the environmental performance of a property would include reducing energy consumption, selecting alternative resources for energy with a lower environmental impact, reducing greenhouse gas emissions and water consumption, improving the efficiency of waste recycling and reducing waste. There may also be data sharing provisions whereby there will usually be a clause where the parties agree to share the environmental performance data they have relating to the premises on a regular basis. A sustainability forum may be drawn up where there will often be an obligation on the landlord to provide a building management group or other forum for review of the environmental performance of the building, improve data sharing, and to agree targets and strategies to improve environmental performance. In return, the tenant agrees to use reasonable endeavours to ensure that a nominated person attends the forum meetings on its behalf. The landlord may also reserve a right to install equipment to ensure to measure the supply of energy and utilities to the premises. Alternatively, the tenant may have a right to require the landlord to install a meter at the premises at the cost of the tenant, or a right to install its own meter. Green leases will also contain a restriction on the tenant carrying out alterations to the premises which might adversely affect the EPC rating of the premises or the building. You might also see a similar covenant by the landlord in respect of alterations to the retained parts of the building. In terms of reinstatement, where a tenant has carried out alterations which improve the environmental performance of the premises or the building, the landlord may prefer for this to be left at the premises on the expiry of the lease term. In terms of reservations of rights, landlords are likely to want to reserve additional rights to enter the premises to carry out works to improve the energy efficiency of the premises or the building so that they can ensure compliance with the MEES obligations. Manufacturing clients will need to carefully consider how disruptive this may be to their operations. Service charge, the landlords will also be keen to ensure that they can pass the costs included in improving environmental performance down to the tenants via the service charge. A green lease will typically extend the definition of services and service costs to include such measures, facilities or services as the landlord considers appropriate to improve environmental performance and costs related to gathering and processing of environmental performance data. EPCs, we've seen EPC clauses in leases for quite a few years now. The tenant covenants to comply with any statutory duty to produce a new EPC for the premises or the building arising as a result of any works it carries out, and then to provide a copy to the landlord. The tenant agrees to cooperate to allow the landlord to obtain an EPC for the premises or the building and to allow an energy assessor to access the premises where required. Manufacturers need to consider to what extent they are able and willing to share in the costs of these green lease provisions, which we have discussed, and also consider if they will have the administrative resource to comply with the obligations, for example, to deal with the data sharing on a regular basis. Turning now to the compliance with MEES regulations, all let commercial property is subject to the MEES regulations. Landlords will be in breach of their MEES duties if they continue to let a commercial property that has an EPC rating below grade E, unless they have made all possible cost-effective energy efficiency improvements prescribed by the MEES regulations, or where one of the exemptions applies. We are often asked by occupiers of commercial property whether a landlord can carry out works to improve the EPC rating of the property during the term of a lease, and whether the landlord can recover the cost of those works from a tenant. The answer to these questions will depend on the bargaining strength of the parties in the case of a new lease, or on an analysis of the lease terms where there is an existing lease. The key lease provisions for occupiers to negotiate or consider are statutory compliance, rights reserved in favour of the landlord, service charge, and consent to works. It is also important to look beyond an E rating for MEES purposes due to the government's aim for all non-domestic rented buildings to meet an EPC level B by 2030. It is therefore crucial that landlords and occupiers consider green lease clauses now to prepare them for future changes to MEES duties. I will now pass back to Karen.
Thanks, Sidra. I'll now look at operational costs, in particular relating to electricity usage. Volatile energy markets mean that electricity costs and usage are constantly in the spotlight for the manufacturing sector. Often, a landlord has a degree of control in terms of electricity usage, from tendering electricity contracts to installing meters and raising appropriate invoices for each tenant on an estate in multi-let scenarios. It's therefore essential that manufacturing tenants carefully review the lease terms relating to supplies at inception of the lease and continue to properly monitor usage during the course of the lease term. I'm going to briefly review the facts of a recent dispute that I dealt with for a manufacturing client before looking at the key terms of the lease which were relevant in that case and in many leases of similar sites before setting out some takeaway points for consideration. So, a quick run through the case study. The case was in relation to a multi-unit site in northwest England, and the tenant's operation was the recycling of plastic. Shortly after entering into the lease, the tenant's landlord entered into an electricity contract with an electricity supplier. There was no consultation with the tenant in relation to the contract entered into. The tenant's position was that the length of contract entered into was not in line with market recommendations that fixed rate energy contracts should be avoided. In addition, in the first few months of the lease, it was identified that the sub-meter for the unit had not been installed. The sub-meter was eventually installed, but A, there was significant operational disruption to the tenant, and B, there was a delay in the installation, resulting in a dispute regarding the charges prior to the installation. To make matters worse, the sub-meter installed was not installed properly, the issues only being identified several months later. This meant that the peak and off-peak usage of electricity had not been recorded, the tenant's position being that they used more off-peak electricity, which should have been at a reduced rate. The issues with the sub-meter meant that it was unclear how the usage had been apportioned. The landlord failed to provide a full breakdown of the electricity recharged and apportioned, and the tenant was therefore unable to sign off payment. The landlord therefore threatened forfeiture of the lease and a claim for the outstanding charges worth hundreds of thousands of pounds. There were two clear issues. Firstly, was the landlord under any obligation under the lease to get the best value contract? Secondly, how should the electricity usage be apportioned in those circumstances? In order to address these issues, the terms of the lease were important. The key lease terms of relevance were, firstly, the definition of rent, service charge, and outgoings. These had implications in terms of the express obligations on the landlord in terms of entering into contracts relating to outgoings. They also had implications in relation to forfeiture, which I'll come on to shortly. Secondly, what did the services include? Did they include a service to enter into an electricity contract? And if so, were there any requirements in terms of such a contract? Could it be argued that if entering into an electricity contract is a service, then the service charge provisions govern those contracts? The next relevant term was the tenant's rights in relation to the running of services. Did those rights include a right to connect into conducting media? Would there be a right to connect a separate meter? We also needed to look at the landlord's obligations in terms of the provision of services. Did the landlord have to act reasonably or consult with the tenant on the contract to be entered into? Was there any obligation to ensure that there was a meter to ascertain peak and off-peak usage? The method of calculation of service charges and supply costs was also relevant. Did the service charge provisions make it clear how costs should be apportioned, especially if no meter was in place? We also had to look at the forfeiture provisions under the lease. If the tenant failed to pay the electricity charges, could the landlord change the locks? This point depends on whether the outgoings and/or the service charge fell under the definition of rent for the purposes of the forfeiture provisions. If they did, the landlord could change the locks without any prior notice. If they didn't, then the failure to pay would constitute a breach under the lease terms, and so the landlord must first serve a Section 146 notice and should arguably issue forfeiture proceedings rather than simply changing the locks. Finally, we had to consider the provisions in relation to set-off and legal and equitable deduction. Usually, commercial leases will state that there's no right of set-off or deduction, which means that the sums invoices are technically payable, even if, for example, the tender process is disputed. The aggrieved party's remedy is to bring proceedings for a declaration as to whether the sums demanded by the landlord are reasonable and payable under the lease, rather than simply withholding payment until that issue is resolved. So, what were the takeaway points from this case? Firstly, it's crucial that the necessary inquiries are made and investigations carried out before a lease is entered into. In particular, tenants should consider what were the historic electricity charges, what contracts have been entered into before, and what is the landlord's process for awarding contracts. Is there a submeter at the property? And if so, how does the submeter work, and can we check that it's operational? If your operation relies on off-peak use, you need to ensure that there's a submeter in place to split this usage. It would also be prudent to ensure that the landlord is under an obligation to get the best value contract, and if possible, that they're under an obligation to consult with you before entering into it and consider any representations or evidence that you put forward. Tenants may also consider engaging an independent energy consultant to review the proposed contract and compare it with other options on the market. If you're a tenant on part of a multi-let site, you must also make sure that you're comfortable with any provisions relating to apportionment, especially if there's no submeter in place. Moving on now to some end-of-term considerations. Given that many manufacturing sites house substantial machinery and equipment, it often makes little operational sense to relocate sites, and tenants often seek to agree renewal leases and roll over their repairing obligations into the new lease. This means that unless disrepair is having a detrimental impact on the landlord's reversion or interest, the repair of the property is not addressed for many years. However, as mentioned earlier, today's market requires the sector to be flexible and respond appropriately to market pressures, and this may inevitably mean relocating or bringing an operation to a close. At the end of a lease term, the repairing liabilities under a lease will crystallise, and they're known as terminal dilapidations. The aim of a landlord's terminal dilapidations claim is to put the landlord in the position they would have been in had the tenant complied with its repairing obligations. So that means if the property was returned to the landlord in full repair, the landlord would not have any repair costs and wouldn't lose out on any rent, service charge and rates whilst they put the premises in repair. If the landlord has spent money on repair costs or lost rent, then that would result in a damages claim against the tenant. Similarly, if a tenant has carried out alterations to the property, the lease may require those alterations to be reinstated. If they aren't, and the landlord has to carry out works to put the property back into a lettable state, the landlord could then seek the costs of those works from the tenant. That said, the landlord's claim is limited by Section 18 of the Landlord and Tenant Act 1927, which puts a cap on the amount a landlord can recover. There are two limits. Firstly, if a landlord intends to do work to the property that would make any repair works undertaken by a tenant a complete waste, the landlord cannot recover damages for that disrepair. Secondly, the landlord's claim is capped at either the cost of the repairs or the diminution in value of the property as a result of the disrepairs. In order to calculate the diminution in value, a valuer will look at what a purchaser would pay at auction for the property in repair and then compare it to what a purchaser would pay for the property in the state it's been left in by the tenant. And the difference in those two values is what the tenant is responsible for. So, for example, the market value of a property in repair might be £150,000, but due to the disrepair, it's only worth £100,000. So here the diminution in value would be £50,000, even if it would cost the landlord £75,000 to put the property into the repair required by the lease. If the property would still only be worth £150,000 in repair, the landlord's loss is capped at £50,000. So I'll finish off with some takeaway points for tenants on commercial dilapidations claims. Firstly, get advice from a building surveyor early so you can adequately budget in advance for any dilapidations claims brought by the landlord. Taking advice early also means that you can consider undertaking some of the works yourself, and you're likely to find cheaper contractors than the landlord would use, and therefore you'll minimise the dilapidations claim. That said, take advice as to which repairs should be undertaken. Given the statutory cap, some repairs won't result in a diminution in value, and therefore arguably you may not need to carry out some of the works. Tenants should push for landlords to give a Section 18 valuation to assist with this point. Similarly, it's worth making inquiries of the landlord as to what their plans for the property are. Are they going to completely redevelop it, making any works that you carry out redundant? Do they already have a new tenant lined up who will take the property as is with no reduction in rent as a result of the disrepair? If so, this may limit the landlord's damages claim against you. It's also important to carefully consider any alterations which you have made and whether you need to reinstate them. Often machinery and racking is attached to the floors and walls of the unit. There is extensive case law surrounding what constitutes a landlord or a tenant fixture, and therefore what should be removed or left at the property, and so it's worthwhile taking advice. Finally, take particular care if you're exiting following service of a break notice. The break may be conditional on you returning the property in a particular way, and if you fail to comply with those conditions, the lease will continue for the remainder of the lease term. In these cases, you need to be prepared well in advance of the break date, particularly if heavy machinery needs to be removed from the property before the break date in order for the break right to be effective. So to summarise, there's lots to consider for the manufacturing sector when navigating property challenges. However, with proactivity and careful planning, tenants can avoid many of the pitfalls and ensure that their properties really are assets and not burdens. We hope you found this webinar useful. Please do get in touch if you have any queries or questions in relation to the issues raised.